In the glass towers of Manhattan's financial district, a sustainability executive was about to discover that her life's work had been weaponized against everything she believed in. What started as a routine review of her ESG presentation took a shocking turn when she noticed the metrics had been quietly altered. Dr. Amina Calderon wasn't your typical Wall Street player. For 3 years, she had spent her life building Norwyn Capital's environmental and social governance framework from nothing, known for her uncompromising commitment to authentic impact measurement. When she received that midnight termination email, she had no idea the board was walking into a trap of their own making. Amina's response, activating a biometric deadman switch she'd built into her own system, would lead to the collapse of one of Wall Street's most celebrated ESG empires. What began as corporate betrayal would become a masterclass in whistleblower justice. The financial world would never be the same after the woman they tried to erase proved that some systems can't be stolen, only borrowed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The presentation deck glowed on my laptop screen, $17.7 billion in impact invest spread across 43 slides, each one meticulously crafted, each metric, verified, each projection backed by 18 months of sleepless nights and calculated risks. My name, Dr. Amina Calderon, was listed on slide 2 under Project Architect, and again on slide 41 under Acknowledgements. Something felt wrong about the spacing. The font looked different, smaller. Somehow like it had been squeezed in as an afterthought. I scrolled back to slide 8, the sustainability metrics dashboard I had built from scratch, the one that tracked carbon reduction across 12 countries, conservation. In 7, the job creation numbers from our partnerships in Kenya, Bangladesh, Peru, every single data point flowing through the echelon. Ethics matrix. I had coded on weekends in my studio apartment, back when Norwyn Capital was still pretending they cared about hiring diverse talent instead of just talking about it. Julian Wright was practicing his speech 3 offices down. I could hear his voice through the thin walls, smooth, confident, each word measured for maximum impact. He would announce this tomorrow at the Sustainable Finance Summit with cameras rolling, reporters scribbling and standing somewhere in the back because apparently chief sustainability strategists didn't need to be front and center when their life's work was being unveiled to the world. The numbers on slide 8 looked right, but felt wrong. I pulled up my original dashboard, the one stored on the secure server, the one only I had root access to, and compared them side by side. Carbon reduction for the Nairobi agricultural project. My version showed 12.3% reduction. Theirs showed 19.7%. Water conservation in the Peru mining initiative. My data said 4 million gallons saved annually. Theirs claimed 11.8 million. My fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. The cursor blinked once, twice, 3 times. While my brain processed what I was seeing, they had changed my numbers, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough to make every project look more successful, impactful, more worthy of that $17.7 billion investment. I opened my secure email to draft a message to Julian when my phone buzzed. A text from Surya Dev, our legal counsel, whom I had hired personally 2 years ago. After she left Doctors Without Borders, tired of watching NGOs get exploited by corporations, pretending to care about social impact. Something is happening tonight. She wrote, "Don't go home yet. Stay close to your computer." I stared at the message, then deleted it from my phone, the way she had taught me back when we first started building the ESG framework together, back when we thought transparency and accountability could actually coexist with profit margins and quarterly reports. 11:47 p.m. I was still at my desk when the email arrived. The subject line read, "Termination notice, effective immediately," and my chest went hollow, like someone had scooped out my lungs with a serving spoon. The sender was HR Notifications at norwyncapital.com. No name, no signature, just a timestamp that read, 11:47:13 p.m. EST. Due to organizational restructuring, your position as Chief Sustainability Strategist has been eliminated. Effective immediately. Please return all company property and surrender your access credentials to security by end of business tomorrow. We appreciate your contributions to Norwyn Capital and wish you well in your future endeavors. I read it 3 times before the words started making sense. 4 times before I noticed they had actually revoked my system access. Yet, 5 times before I realized this wasn't an accident. It was a test to see if I would go quietly into that good night or if I would do exactly what I was doing right now. I opened a new terminal window and logged into the Echelon Ethics Matrix. The system I had built, the code I had written, the digital infrastructure that validated every single dollar of ESG investment flowing through Norwyn Capital, and I started downloading everything: my original metrics reports, the real impact assessments, the communications with our international partners, meeting minutes, where Julian had called my framework brilliant, revolutionary, a game changer for sustainable finance. The download progress bar crawled across my screen: 47%, 53%, 68%, while I sat in the empty office, surrounded by potted plants that someone else would water from now on, surrounded by awards and certifications that bore my name, but apparently not my future. At 79%, my phone buzzed again. Saria, this time calling, not texting. They moved up the timeline, she said. Without hello, without explanation. They were supposed to wait until after the announcement. What timeline, I asked. But I already knew: the restructuring. She said the executive reshuffling, the transition to new leadership. Julian convinced the board that ESG strategy should be managed internally by existing teams, not external hires. External hires, I repeated. Been here for 3 years. I built this program from nothing. I know, she said, and she sounded tired, older than her 34 years. You were never supposed to see the final presentation. They changed your metrics after you left tonight. The download hit 100%, and I closed my laptop, feeling the weight of it in my hands, the weight of everything I had built, everything they were about to claim as their own, everything they thought they could take from me. But they forgot one thing. When I built the Echelon Ethics Matrix, I built it with safeguards, redundancy, backup systems, required biometric authentication, my biometric authentication, because trust in sustainable finance wasn't just about the money, it was about who controlled the truth. I walked out of Norwyn Capital at 12:37 a.m., carrying my laptop, my backup drives, and the knowledge that tomorrow Wright would announce my ESG framework to the world without my name, without my presence, and without understanding that I still held the keys to everything they thought they owned. The security guard nodded at me like nothing had changed, like I would be back on Monday, like some things were fundamental to alter with a single email. But I knew better, and more importantly, I knew exactly what they had forgotten to take away from me. My apartment felt smaller at 1:15 a.m., like the walls had moved closer together. While I was gone, the coffee maker gurgled to life while I spread months of ESG reports across my kitchen table, comparing my original metrics to the versions Julian would present tomorrow, each discrepancy highlighted in yellow, each inflated number circled in red, until the documents looked like a crime scene. The Nairobi agricultural project was the worst. They claimed we had reduced carbon emissions by 19.7%. When my data showed 12.3, they said we created 847 sustainable jobs. When the actual number was 412, they listed water conservation at 6.2 million gallons annually, when Malik Otieno and I had calculated 2.8 million at best. Malik Otieno. My head started spinning, thinking about him, about the phone calls we had shared at 3 a.m., his time, 6 p.m., mine, while he walked me through the solar irrigation systems we had funded together, while he explained how our microfinancing was helping smallholder farmers transition from subsistence to sustainable agriculture, while he trusted me to tell his story. Honestly, I found his number in my contacts and called without checking the time zones, without considering that it was 7:23 a.m. in Nairobi, without thinking about anything except the need to know if what I suspected was true. Amina, he answered on the second ring, and his voice sounded hollow, distant, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. "Malik," I said, "how is the project? How are the farmers? How is the funding holding up?" There was a long silence punctuated by static and what sounded like traffic in the background. Then he spoke slowly, carefully, like someone who had practiced disappointing news. "The funding stopped 6 weeks ago. Amina," they said. "There were complications with compliance issues, with oversight," they said. "The project was being restructured under new management." "What new management?" I asked. But my stomach already knew. "A company called Verde Consulting. They have no agriculture experience, no local partnerships, no understanding of what we built here. They came with clipboards and spreadsheets and promises to streamline operations." Verde Consulting. I had never heard of them, which meant they weren't in my original ESG framework, which meant Julian had created them after I finished the impact assessments, which meant, "Malik, are they still using your project in their marketing materials?" "Yes," he said. Voice got quieter. "They sent a photographer last month. Beautiful pictures of our solar arrays, our community center, the school we built with ESG funds. They said the photos would help secure additional investment for expansion, but there is no additional investment. There is barely enough funding to maintain what we have already built. The farmers are confused. Amina, they trusted us. They transitioned their entire agricultural model based on our promises, and now they were being used as props for Norwyn Capital's ESG theater, while Verde Consulting collect management fees, and Julian Wright prepared to announce their success to the global financial media. I hung up and immediately called Tessa Kim, the junior data analyst who had joined my team 8 months ago, fresh from Columbia with a master's in environmental economics and an idealism that reminded me of myself at 26. She answered on the 4th ring. "Dr. Calderon," she said, and I could hear confusion in her voice. "I just saw the email about your termination. What happened? I need to ask you something, Tessa, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Do you still have access to the original ESG databases, the ones I built before the recent updates?" There was a pause, then typing sounds, then more typing, then a sharp intake of breath. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Dr. Calderon, what did they do to your data? What do you see?" "Tessa, the carbon reduction numbers for Nairobi, they changed them. The creation metrics for Peru, they inflated them. The water conservation data for Bangladesh, they basically doubled it, all of it, everything. You spent 18 months calculating and verifying. They just went in and changed it. Do you have backups?" "I always have backups," she said. "You taught me that. Remember, trust, but verify, and always verify with redundant data sources. I have everything backed up on an encrypted external drive, including the original communications with international partners." I closed my eyes and felt something that might have been relief or might have been rage, or might have been the first stirring of a plan that would require me to be smarter and more patient than I had ever been in my life. "Tessa," I said, "can you meet me tomorrow morning, somewhere quiet, somewhere away from Norwyn?" "Yes," she said, "absolutely." "How do you know this?" "Because I helped draft the legal structures," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. "I thought we were creating legitimate partnerships. I thought the complexity was necessary for international compliance. I didn't realize until after you were fired that Julian was using my legal framework to hide money, not protect it." Saria pulled out a small flash drive and slid it across the table. "Email chains," she said, "between Julian and Eli discussing how to modify your metrics board meeting recordings, where they talk about managing your involvement, financial documents, fund transfers to the shell companies, everything you need to prove intentional fraud." I stared at the flash drive, feeling the weight of everything it contained. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because what we built was supposed to matter," she said. "Because the farmers in Kenya and the communities in Peru and the environmental projects in Bangladesh were supposed to be real, not just props for corporate theater, and because someone needs to hold them accountable for turning our work into a lie." After Saria left, I sat in the library for another hour, thinking about the flash drive in my pocket, about Clara's deadline, thinking about the press conference Julian had scheduled for tomorrow, where he would announce Norwyn's expansion of their ESG initiative to include investments in Southeast Asia. Another $2 billion in impact investing that would probably impact nothing except Norwyn's reputation and stock price. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Norwyn Capital announces expanded ESG initiative, CEO Julian Wright, to discuss revolutionary approach to sustainable finance at tomorrow's Global Investment Summit. I clicked the link and read the full press release, which described Julian as the visionary behind Norwyn's ESG transformation, and quoted him saying, "We've assembled the most sophisticated impact assessment system in the industry, allowing us to verify and validate sustainable outcomes with unprecedented precision. My impact assessment system, my precision validation protocols. My 3 years of sleepless nights, reduced to a corporate press release that didn't include my name, didn't acknowledge my contributions, didn't even hint that the system they were celebrating was built by someone they had fired via email at midnight. But they made one critical mistake in their rush to claim credit for my work and their eagerness to present Julian as the architect of sustainable finance innovation. They forgot that the system they were celebrating still required my biometric authentication for any transaction over $500,000. And tomorrow, when Jules stood in front of cameras and investors and financial media representatives, announcing Norwyn's expanded ESG initiative, he would have no idea that the woman he had erased from his narrative still held the keys to everything he thought he controlled. I called Clara from the library steps. "I have what you need," I said. The smoking gun and something else. Something they don't know. I have what's that? The ability to turn off their entire ESG infrastructure with a single command. There was a long pause, then Clara laughed for the first time since we had met. Now that she said sounds like a story worth telling. By the time I got home that evening, news outlets were already running preview coverage of Julian's announcement. Tomorrow, Bloomberg had posted an article titled, "How Norwyn Capital Became Wall Street's ESG Pioneer," and the Financial Times was promoting an exclusive interview with Julian about the future of sustainable finance. Everywhere I looked, Julian Wright was being celebrated as a visionary, a leader, a pioneer in responsible investing, while the actual architect of his celebrated system sat in her apartment, planning to remind the world that some things can't be stolen, only borrowed, and eventually borrowed things have to be returned to their rightful owners, whether the borrowers like it or not. At 3:37 a.m., I sat in the blue glow of my laptop screen, connected to a secure terminal that Norwyn's IT department had forgotten existed, a legacy access point buried in the basement server room that still carried my administrative privileges from the early days when I built the Echelon ethics matrix by myself on weekends, when the only people in the building were security guards and cleaning crews. The system architecture was elegant in its simplicity. Every ESG transaction over $500,000 required 3 forms of authentication: financial approval from the CFO, legal clearance from compliance, and biometric confirmation from the system architect. Me, the woman they had just erased from their corporate history. Julian's press conference was scheduled for 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Just 6.5 hours from now, he would stand in front of the Global Investment Summit, announce Norwyn's expansion. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story, into Southeast Asian sustainable development, and authorize the transfer of $2 billion through my ESG verification system, except he couldn't authorize anything because he wasn't me. I navigated to the core authentication module, the heart of everything I had built, and opened the administrative console that I hadn't accessed since the week before. My termination, back when I still believed that Julian Wright was committed to authentic sustainable finance. Back when I thought we were building something that would outlast both of us. Dead Man Switch was exactly where I had left it, buried in lines of code that looked like routine security protocols, but functioned as something much more powerful: a digital insurance policy that would prevent unauthorized use of my system in case of exactly the scenario I was now facing. Unauthorized removal of primary architect detected. The system prompted, "Do you wish to implement protective measures?" I hesitated for a moment, thinking about Tessa Kim, who would probably lose her job, thinking about Surya Dev, who had already risked everything to help me, thinking about all the people at Norwyn genuinely believed they were working for a company that cared about environmental and social impact. Then I thought about Malik Oteno's farmers waiting for funding that would never come about, the communities in Peru, being used as props for corporate marketing about the $17.7 billion that was supposed to create real change in the world, but was instead creating change only in Norwyn's stock price. Yes, I typed, implement protective measures. The system prompted for biometric confirmation, and I pressed my thumb to the laptop's fingerprint scanner, watched as my identity was verified, and felt something that might have been satisfaction or might have been justice, as the dead man switch activated all ESG transactions, over $500,000, now required live biometric confirmation from Dr. Amina Calderon, primary system architect, access to be granted only through secure terminal authentication. Identity verification must be completed within 60 minutes of each transfer request. I opened a new command window and began typing a system log entry that would be automatically distributed to all administrative users. In exactly 6 hours, entry logged by Prime System Architect, Dr. Amina Calderon. Biometric authentication protocols implemented due to unauthorized personnel changes. Data integrity requires source verification. Impact measurement demands transparency. All ESG fund transfers over $500K USD now require architect authorization. Effective immediate architectural ownership supersedes administrative convenience. Authentic impact supersedes corporate presentation. Data belongs to its source. Integrity is not negotiable. I saved the entry, scheduled it for automatic distribution at 9:55 a.m., 5 minutes before Julian's press conference, closed the terminal. Feeling something that definitely was satisfaction, my phone alarm went off at 9:15 a.m., and I turned on the live stream of the Global Investment Summit from my kitchen. While making coffee, Julian looked confident, polished, standing behind a podium with the Norwyn Capital logo prominently displayed, while financial journalists and investment analysts filled the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian began. Today marks a historic moment for sustainable finance. Norwyn Capital is proud to announce our expansion into Southeast Asian development projects, representing a $2 billion commitment to environmental and social impact. He clicked to his first slide, showing a map of proposed projects in Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia, each one marked with Norwyn's corporate branding, each one promising job creation, carbon reduction, water conservation. Our proprietary impact assessment system, Julian continued, has allowed us to identify and verify sustainable investment opportunities with unprecedented precision. This system, developed by our world-class team of sustainability experts, enables real-time monitoring of environmental and social outcomes. Behind him, a screen showed the Verde Impact Assessment Platform interface, the system that used to be called the Echelon Ethics Matrix back when it had my name attached to it. And now, Julian said, we're ready to demonstrate the seamless integration of our sustainability protocols with our investment capability. Nodded to someone off camera, and I watched as Eli Boudreau walked onto the stage, carrying a tablet, approaching what looked like a ceremonial transfer authorization ceremony designed to show the audience how efficiently Norwyn could deploy ESG capital. Julian clicked to a slide showing $2 ready for immediate transfer to Sustainable Futures Initiative, one of the Shell NGOs Surya had identified. He smiled at the camera. With a single authorization, we can move $2 billion into projects that will create jobs, protect environments, and build communities across Southeast Asia. Eli tapped his tablet, swiped through what looked like a financial interface, and pressed a large green button labeled Authorize Transfer. Nothing happened. Eli pressed the button again, tapped the screen, checked the Wi-Fi connection while Julian maintained his smile, but I could see something changing in his eyes. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian said with a slight laugh, it appears we're having a minor technical difficulty with our demonstration. Eli whispered something in Julian's ear, and I watched Julian's confident expression shift to confusion, then concern, then something that looked like panic. System. Julian announced with forced cheerfulness, requires additional security verification for large transfers, which demonstrates our commitment to thorough oversight. But I could see him calculating, trying to understand why the system he thought he controlled was suddenly unresponsive, trying to figure out what had gone wrong with his perfectly choreographed presentation. My laptop chimed with a notification. The system log entry had been distributed 5 minutes early, triggered by the failed authorization attempt, and I opened my email to see the message that was now appearing on Norwyn administrative terminal entry logged by primary system architect, Dr. Amina Calderon. Unauthorized transfer attempt detected, system lockdown initiated pending architect authorization, data integrity protected. Impact measurement restored, authentic verification required somewhere in man. Julian Wright was discovering that the woman he had erased from his narrative still held the keys to everything he had built his reputation on, and I was just getting started. Clara's article went live at 6:14 a.m. Eastern Time with a headline that made my coffee taste better than it had in weeks. Norwyn Capital's ESG fraud. How Wall Street's sustainability pioneer built an empire on lies, and I knew Julian Wright was having the worst morning of his professional life. The piece was devastating, methodical, surgical. Clara had used every document Surya provided, every email chain showing intentional manipulation, every financial record proving money laundering through shell NGOs, every recorded conversation where executives discussed managing my involvement in the ESG framework I had created. She quoted Malik Otieno, describing how his agricultural project had been defunded, then used for marketing materials. She included Tessa's analysis showing how the metrics had been systematically inflated. She even embedded audio from board meetings where Julian explicitly discussed removing me from the narrative while keeping my system operational. But the crown jewel, the detail that was already being picked up by Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal, was the technical breakdown of how I had used my own deadman switch to lock down Norwyn's ESG infrastructure. During Julian's live presentation demonstrating that their celebrated sustainability framework was entirely dependent on the woman they had fired via midnight email. My phone started ringing at 6:30 a.m. Reporters, investment analysts, former colleagues at other firms. Everyone wanted to know if Clara's article was accurate, if I really had the power to shut down $17.7 billion in ESG investments. If Julian Wright had really built his reputation on my stolen work. I let most calls go to voicemail, but at 8:15 when Tessa called, I answered. Dr. Calderon, she said, her voice was shaking. They fired me this morning. Security walked me out. They said my access to confidential data violated my employment agreement. I'm sorry, Tessa. This is my fault. No, she said. This is their fault. You didn't force them to lie. You didn't force them to steal your work. You didn't force them to use ESG investments as corporate theater. They did that themselves, and someone needed to hold them accountable. At 9:45, Julian held an emergency press conference from Norwyn's headquarters, looking like he hadn't slept, which he probably hadn't. His usual polish was gone, replaced by the kind of defensive anger that comes from being caught doing exactly what you've been accused of doing. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, these allegations against Norwyn Capital are completely unfounded. They represent a coordinated attack by a disgruntled former employee who has chosen to sabotage sustainability initiatives rather than accept the natural evolution of our ESG framework. He paused, looked directly into the camera, his jaw tight. Dr. Calderon's claims that she single-handedly created our impact assessment system are simply false. Our ESG framework was developed by a team of experts over several years and represents the collective expertise of multiple departments. While Dr. Calderon made contributions to the initial framework, her role was always limited, and her recent actions demonstrate why her employment was terminated. I watched from my apartment, feeling something between amusement and rage, as Julian tried to rewrite history in real time, tried to minimize my contributions, while simultaneously explaining why those minimal contributions had been significant enough to sabotage his entire operation. The questions from reporters were brutal. Mr. Wright, if Dr. Calderon's role was so limited, Why does your system require her biometric authentication? Mr. Wright, can you explain why ESG funds were transferred to companies that didn't exist before this year? Mr. Wright, do you have any comment on the audio recordings where you discuss managing Dr. Calderon's involvement? Julian's answers got shorter, more defensive, more obviously scripted, until finally his communications director stepped up to the microphone. That concludes today's statement. Norwyn Capital will be responding to these allegations through appropriate legal channels. By noon, investment firms had announced they were reviewing their partnerships with Norwyn Capital. The SEC had issued a statement saying they were aware of the allegations and monitoring the situation, and ESG fraud was trending on social media, with Clara's article being shared thousands of times. But the response that mattered most came at 2:30 p.m. when Clara called. "They're threatening my editor," she said. "Norwyn's legal team is claiming the article contains proprietary information that was obtained illegally. They're demanding a retraction and threatening to sue the Financial Times for damage." "What did your editor say?" "She told them to go to hell," Clara said, but more politely, and she assigned 3 more reporters to dig deeper into Norwyn's ESG operations. Apparently, Julian's press conference raised more questions than it answered that evening. I sat in my apartment watching the financial news networks dissect the story, watching analysts debate whether this was an isolated incident or evidence of broader problems in ESG investing. Watching Julian's carefully constructed narrative crumble in real time. CNBC ran a segment titled, "The Woman Who Brought Down Wall Street's ESG Pie," featuring an interview with Greg Blaine, who explained how my original ESG framework was designed to prevent exactly the kind of manipulation Norwyn had attempted. Bloomberg published a follow-up piece titled, "How Biometric Authentication Became a Whistleblower's Best Friend," describing the technical details of my dead man switch and speculating about how many other ESG frameworks might contain similar safeguards. But Fox Business ran a different angle titled, "Disgruntled Employee Uses Technical Backdoor to Attack Former Employer," featuring an interview with a corporate security expert who called my actions a dangerous precedent for insider threats. I turned off the television and opened my laptop to an email from Sam, my younger brother, who ran a community legal aid nonprofit in Chicago. "Amina," he wrote, "I've been watching the news and I'm proud of you for standing up to these people. Need to understand that this is just the beginning. They're going to come after you. Legally, financially, personally. You need protection, and you need it now. There are federal whistleblower protections for ESG fraud, and I think you qualify, but you need to file a formal complaint within 90 days of your termination, which means you have about 3 weeks to decide if you want to make this official." I read his email twice, then walked to my window looking out at Manhattan, thinking about Malik's farmers and Tessa's backup drives and Clara's article, and Julian's press conference, and the $7.7 billion that was still locked in my system waiting for authorization, that I might never give. 3 weeks to decide if I wanted to turn this from a news story into a legal war. 3 weeks to decide if I was ready to fight Norwyn Capital's army of lawyers, with nothing but truth, and a dead man switch. That proved my point. I opened a reply to Sam and typed 2 words. "Let's fight." Sam's office in Chicago looked like a hurricane had hit a law library, papers stacked on every surface case, files overflowing from cardboard boxes, legal briefs taped to walls, creating a collage of social justice battles won and lost. But when he cleared a space on his desk for the federal whistleblower complaint forms, I could see the same methodical precision that had gotten him through Harvard Law, the same attention to detail that made corporate executives nervous. The ESG fraud provision under Sarbanes-Oxley are relatively new, he said, spreading out 3 different sets of forms, but they're designed exactly for situations like yours: environmental, social, and governance misrepresentation in publicly traded companies, especially when it involves material misstatements to investors. Stared at the forms, feeling the weight of what filing them would mean: the formal accusations, the legal depositions, the months or years of litigation ahead. "What happens when I file this?" "Several things," Sam said. "First, you get federal protection against retaliation. which means Norwyn can't sue you using your dead man switch or providing information to journalists. Second, the SEC has to investigate within 90 days. And third, if they find evidence of fraud, you're entitled to a percentage of any monetary penalties. How much of a percentage? 10 to 30% of whatever the SEC recovers, said, which in a case involving $17.7 billion could be substantial. While Sam walked me through the legal implications, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Norwyn Capital stock down 23% as ESG investigation, and I realized that Julian's attempt to minimize my role had backfired spectacularly. Instead of containing the story, he had drawn more attention to it. CNN was now running hourly updates on what they called ESG Gate. The Wall Street Journal had assigned a team of reporters to investigate other firms' sustainability claims, and Bloomberg was tracking the broader market impact as investors questioned the authenticity of ESG investing across the entire financial sector. But the story that made me smile was from TechCrunch, titled "The Code That Brought Down Wall Street," featuring an interview with a cybersecurity expert who called my dead man switch an elegant solution to corporate accountability and suggested that more whistleblowers should build similar safeguards into critical systems. Sam finished explaining the legal process and leaned back in his chair. "There's something else you should know," he said. "Norwyn filed a motion yesterday claiming that use of the dead man switch constitutes corporate sabotage. They're arguing that your biometric locks violate your termination agreement, and they want a court order forcing you to unlock the system." "Can they do that?" "They can try," he said, "but you built that system, you own the intellectual property, you included the safeguards in the original design documentation. If they wanted unrestricted access, they should have negotiated that before they fired you." I signed the whistleblower complaint forms at 3:47 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon in a small law office in Chicago, surrounded by the kind of legal chaos that usually meant someone was fighting for something that mattered more than money. Sam made copies of everything, then walked me to the federal building where we filed the complaint with the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower by 4:15 p.m. Dr. Amina Calderon versus Norwyn Capital was officially a federal case. The response was swift and brutal. By 6 p.m., Norwyn's legal team had issued a statement, calling my complaint a malicious attempt to extort money from a company that had legitimately terminated my employment for performance issues. They claimed my dead man switch was an act of corporate sabotage designed to damage Norwyn's reputation and harm their clients. Julian appeared on CNBC's Closing Bell looking haggard, defensive. "Dr. Calderon is clearly attempting to monetize her termination," he said. "We terminated her employment because her work no longer met our standards, and her response has been to use technical backdoors to attack our operations. This complaint is nothing more than legalized extortion." But the interviewer wasn't buying it. "Mr. Wright, if Dr. Calderon's work didn't meet your standards, why does your entire ESG infrastructure depend on her biometric authentication?" Julian's pause was long enough to be uncomfortable. "Our system has evolved significantly since Dr. Calderon's departure. We're implementing new protocols that will eliminate any dependencies on former employees." "When will those new protocols be ready?" "Soon," Julian said. "Very soon." That evening I sat in my hotel room watching the financial news and feeling something that might have been vindication, or might have been exhaustion, as reporters dissected Julian's interview, pointing out that he hadn't actually answered the question about when Norwyn would regain control of the ESG investments. My phone rang at 9:30 p.m., an unknown number with a New York area code. "Dr. Calderon," said a voice. I didn't recognize. "This is Jonathan White from Global ESG Trust." I recognized the name, one of the largest independent sustainability investment firms in the world, the kind of organization that actually cared about environmental and social impact instead of just using it for marketing. "We've been following your situation," Mr. White continued, "and we'd like to discuss a potential opportunity with you." "What kind of opportunity?" "We're launching a new initiative," he said. "An ESG framework built on transparency and accountability. We need someone who understands both the technical requirements and the ethical implications. Someone who can't be bought or intimidated. Someone exactly like you. I leaned back against the hotel room's pillows, feeling something shift inside me, something that had been locked down since that midnight termination. Email, tell me more, I said. We call it Gate 47. Mr. White continued, a reference to your original system architecture, but built from the ground up with independent oversight, immutable data verification, and complete transparency. We want you to lead it, and Norwyn can keep fighting their legal battles. He said, we're more interested in building something that works. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and started researching global ESG trust, their track record, their leadership, their actual impact on the communities and environments they claim to support, and for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I found myself thinking about something other than revenge. I found myself thinking about what came next, about building something better, about proving that ESG investing could work if it was done by people who actually cared about more than quarterly earnings reports. My phone buzzed with a text from Tessa, who had been surprisingly quiet since her termination. Dr. Calderon, she wrote, I know you're fighting Norwyn, but when you're ready to build something new. I'm ready to help. I smiled, typed back soon, and closed my laptop, feeling like maybe the real victory wouldn't be destroying Julian Wright's career. Maybe it would be making him irrelevant. Jonathan White's office overlooked Central Park from the 42nd floor of a building that probably cost more per square foot than most people's annual salaries. But when he offered me coffee in a simple ceramic mug instead of bone china, when he sat across from me at a small wooden table instead of behind an imposing desk, I realized this wasn't going to be another corporate recruitment pitch. We've been tracking ESG fraud for 3 years. He said. And what happened at Norwyn isn't an isolated incident, it's a symptom of a system that prioritizes optics over outcomes, marketing over measurement. He pulled out a tablet and showed me a presentation, Impact Architecture. But instead of polished graphics and corporate buzzwords, it was filled with technical specifications, data flow, diagrams, security protocols that looked familiar. You built this based on my original framework, I said. We built this because your original framework was right, he said. Impact measurement requires immutable data verification, requires independent oversight, requires safeguards against manipulation, but most importantly, it requires people who understand that the technology is only as trustworthy as the people who control it. Jonathan clicked to the next slide, showing an organizational chart, unlike anything I had seen in corporate finance. Gate 47 would be structured as a public benefit corporation, with an independent board of directors that included environmental scientists, community organizers, former NGO leaders, people who understood that ESG investing was supposed to serve communities, not shareholders. The technical architecture was elegant, secure, distributed instead of centralized control. Gate 47 would use blockchain verification for all impact data, multiple independent auditing systems, and what Jonathan called democratic accountability. Communities affected by ESG investments would have direct input into project evaluation, but the detail that made me lean forward was the governance structure. Unlike Norwyn's traditional corporate hierarchy, Gate 47 would be led by a chief impact officer who couldn't be fired without cause, be overruled by executives focused on profits, couldn't be marginalized when ethical considerations conflicted with financial convenience. We want you to be that chief impact officer. Jonathan said, we want you to build something that can't be hijacked by people who see ESG as a marketing opportunity instead of a moral obligation. What about Norwyn? What about the legal case? Fight them, he said. But don't let fighting them consume you. The best revenge against corporate fraud isn't destroying the fraudsters, it's building something so much better that they become irrelevant. After the meeting, through Central Park, thinking about everything Jonathan had proposed, thinking about the opportunity to build ESG investing the way it was supposed to work, thinking about the chance to create something that actually served the farmers in Kenya, the communities in Peru, the environmental projects that had been turned into props for Norwyn's corporate theater. My phone rang. Tessa calling from a number I didn't recognize. Dr. Calderon, she said. I know, I shouldn't be calling you. Well, the legal case is pending, but I heard rumors about Gate 47, and I wanted you to know that if you decide to do this, ready to help. How did you hear about Gate 47? Saria told me. She said, she's thinking about leaving Norwyn too. Apparently half the ESG team is updating their resumes after what happened with your presentation. I smiled, feeling something that might have been hope. Tessa, what would you say if I told you we could build an ESG framework that actually worked, that actually measured real impact, that couldn't be manipulated by executives who care more about stock prices than environmental outcomes? I would say, she said. When do we start? That evening, I video called Malik from my apartment using an encrypted connection we had established back when we were partners instead of casualties of corporate fraud. My friend, he said, and I could see exhaustion in his eyes, but also something that might have been curiosity. The news about Norwyn has reached Kenya. The farmers are asking if this means their project might be restored. Maybe, I said. Or maybe we could build something better. He raised an eyebrow. Better? How? Independent oversight, community control, transparent impact measurement, and most importantly, funding that can't be diverted to shell companies or used for corporate marketing. Forward interested. Tell me more, I explained. Gate 47's structure, the blockchain verification, the democratic accountability, the safeguards against manipulation, while Malik took notes, occasionally asking technical questions that reminded me why I had trusted him with the original Norwyn partnership. This could work, he said. Finally, but only if the people running it actually care about impact more than profits. That's exactly why it will work, I said. Because this time we get to choose who runs it. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and started drafting my response to Jonathan's offer. Acceptance. Not yet, but a set of conditions that would ensure Gate 47 couldn't become another Norwyn. First, complete transparency in all operations, including executive compensation and board decisions. Second, independent auditing by organizations chosen by affected communities, not corporate partners. Third, immutable data systems that couldn't be altered without biometric confirmation from multiple sources. And fourth, a governance structure that prioritized impact over earnings. I was halfway through typing when my phone buzzed with a text from Sam. Amina. He wrote, Norwyn just filed an emergency motion, claiming your dead man switch is causing material harm to their investors. They want a federal judge to order you to unlock the system within 72 hours. I stared at the message, feeling the familiar mixture of anger and satisfaction that had become my default emotional state since the whole thing started. Let them file their motion, I typed back. By the time it gets to court, they'll realize they picked a fight with the wrong person. And Sam, one more thing. Yes, get ready to incorporate a new company. We're going to build something that makes Norwyn look like amateur hour, because that's the best way to win. A war against corporate fraud wasn't just to expose the fraudsters, it was to make them obsolete. The incorporation papers for Gate 47, Public Benefit Corporation, were filed on a Monday morning in Delaware, while Norwyn's emergency motion was being argued in federal court in Manhattan. And I couldn't help but appreciate the symmetry of building something new, while Julian fought to control something that had never really belonged to him. Jonathan had moved fast, assembling a board of directors that read like a who's who of actual ESG expertise. Dr. Maria Santos, environmental scientist from Stanford. Dr. James Okafor, former director of African Development Bank. Sarah Chen, who had built transparency systems for international NGOs, and 3 community representatives from regions where ESG investments had failed due to corporate mismanagement. Our first board meeting was held in a conference room that could have fit inside Julian's personal office, but when Maria presented the technical architecture for our impact verification system, when James outlined our community partnership protocols, when Sarah demonstrated the blockchain auditing framework, I realized we were building something that could actually work. The funding came from sources that actually understood sustainable development instead of trying to profit from it. The Ford Foundation committed $50 million, the Rockefeller Foundation added $37 million, and a consortium of family offices focused on environmental impact provided another $112 million. But the commitment that meant the most came from an unexpected source, Greg Blaine, who had liquidated part of his Norwyn stock portfolio to contribute $25 million to Gate 47's launch. "This is how I should have spent the last 20 years, he told me when he signed the commitment letter, "building something that matters instead of protecting something that doesn't." Tessa joined as our head of data integrity, bringing with her not just technical expertise, but also the moral courage she had demonstrated by backing up the original Norwyn files. Surya left Norwyn to become our general counsel, citing irreconcilable differences with the firm's ethical direction, and Malik signed on as our director of community partnership, based in Nairobi. By Thursday we had a functioning organization, a technical infrastructure, commitments from 3 major pension funds to evaluate our framework for their ESG allocations. By Friday Norwyn's emergency motion had been denied. The federal judge ruled that since I had built the authentication system, included it in the original design documentation, and retained intellectual property rights through my employment contract, my use of biometric locks was not sabotage, but rather enforcement of my own security protocols. Julian's response was predictably bitter. "This ruling sets a dangerous precedent," he told Bloomberg, allowing disgruntled employees to hold their former employers hostage through technical backdoors will chill innovation and discourage companies from investing in new technologies. But the market's response told a different story. Norwyn stock continued falling, while ESG-focused firms saw increased investor interest as clients looked for alternatives to companies caught in fraud scandals. The real validation came on the following Monday, when Gate 47 announced our first project partnership, a sustainable agriculture initiative in Guatemala that would provide direct funding to farmer cooperatives, with impact verification managed by the communities themselves instead of corporate intermediaries. The funding mechanism was everything I had wanted to build at Norwyn: blockchain verification of all financial transfers, real-time impact monitoring by independent auditors, and community oversight that couldn't be overruled by executives in Manhattan. Boardrooms. Malik called me from our Guatemala site visit sounding more energetic than he had in months. "Amina," he said, "these farmers understand exactly what we're trying to do. They've been exploited by too many corporations that promised partnership and delivered extraction. They want transparency. They want control. They want proof that their work matters." "How does the verification system look?" "Beautiful," he said, "immutable, simple, elegant, everything we wanted the original Norwyn system to be before they corrupted it." That evening, I sat in Gate 47's modest office space in downtown Manhattan, reviewing impact reports from Guatemala and feeling something I hadn't experienced since before my termination. The satisfaction of building something that actually worked. My phone buzzed with a news alert. Norwyn Capital announces leadership changes. CEO Julian Wright to step down amid ongoing ESG investigation. I clicked the link and read that Julian was being replaced by an interim CEO, while the company underwent what they called a comprehensive review of ESG practices, governance. Eli had been placed on administrative leave, pending the SEC investigation. And the board had hired a crisis management firm to handle media relations, but the detail that made me smile was buried in the final paragraph of the press release. Norwyn Capital is exploring partnerships with independent ESG verification firms to restore investor confidence and ensure compliance with evolving sustainability standards. In other words, they were looking for someone to replace the system. I had built the system they had stolen, the system they still couldn't access without my biometric authorization. I opened my laptop and drafted an email to Clara, who had been following the Gate 47 launch for her ongoing series on ESG fraud and reform. "Clara," I wrote, I think you might be interested in our first quarterly impact report from Guatemala. Real data, real verification, real impact from communities that actually control their own development. No shell companies, no inflated metrics, no corporate theater, just the kind of ESG investing that actually works when it's done by people who care about outcomes more than optics. After I sent the email, I walked to the window looking out at Manhattan thinking about how much had changed in just a few months from a midnight termination email to building something that could outlast any individual company or executive. Greg had been right. The best response to corporate fraud wasn't just destroying the fraudsters, it was making them irrelevant and based on the flood of partnership requests we were receiving from pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and impact investors who wanted authentic ESG verification. Gate 47 was well on its way to doing exactly that. The final funding agreement for Gate 47 sat on a wooden conference table in a room that smelled like old books and strong coffee, nothing like the marble and chrome boardrooms where I had spent the last 3 years watching Julian Wright turn my life's work into corporate theater. The only people present were Jonathan, Maria, James, Sarah, and me. No lawyers, no media, executives more concerned with quarterly earnings than quarterly impact. $17.7 billion, the same amount that had been locked in my Norwyn authentication system for the past 6 months. Now committed to Gate 47's transparent ESG framework with one important difference. This time my name was on the first page, not buried in footnotes, not hidden in technical specifications, but right at the top under Chief Impact Officer Dr. Amina Calderon. I picked up the pen, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment: the midnight termination email, the discovery of manipulated data, the failed transfer during Julian's presentation, the whistleblower complaint, the legal battles, the choice to build something new instead of just tearing down something corrupt before I signed. I thought about Malik's farmers, who would now have funding that couldn't be diverted to shell companies, about communities in Peru and Bangladesh and Guatemala, who would control their own development projects, about Tessa and Syria, and Greg, who had risked their careers to support transparency over convenience. This is it, I said to the room, to myself, to the future. We were about to create, and signed my full name, Dr. Amina Calderon, in handwriting that was clear, confident, unambiguous, then added a line that wasn't in the original agreement: for those who build in silence. Jonathan smiled. Maria nodded. James leaned back in his chair, and Sarah took a photo with her phone, not for social media, for press releases, but for the moment when we would need to remember why we started this. My phone buzzed with a message from Clara, whose investigation had expanded into a broader series on corporate ESG fraud and the reformers working to fix it. Amina, she wrote, the Financial Times wants to run a profile on Gate 47's launch. Working title: The Woman Who Held the Line. Interested in an interview? I typed back, yes, but only if we can do it at our Guatemala project site with the farmers who are actually benefiting from authentic ESG investment. Within an hour of signing the agreement, news alerts started appearing on my phone. Breakthrough ESG firm secures record funding. Gate 47 to manage 7B and transparent impact investment. Former Norwyn architect launches revolutionary sustainability platform. But the notification that mattered most came from an encrypted messaging app. Malik from Kenya, with a photo of solar panels being installed at a community center funded through our new verification system. It works. He wrote, the farmers control the funding, the community controls the oversight. And the impact is real, measurable, immutable. Exactly what we dreamed of building that evening. I walked through the empty Gate 47 office, looking at whiteboards covered with project timelines, impact metrics, community partnership agreements, the infrastructure of something that couldn't be hijacked by executives who saw ESG as a marketing opportunity instead of a moral obligation. Laptop chimed with an email from an address I didn't recognize at first glance. Julian Wright, consulting@gmail.com, Dr. Calderon. The message read, I wanted to reach out personally to congratulate you on Gate 47's success. It's clear that your vision for ESG verification was ahead of its time. I'm glad to see it receiving the recognition it deserves. Norwyn is implementing new ESG protocols, and we would welcome the opportunity to discuss potential partnership with Gate 47. Your expertise would be invaluable as we work to rebuild investor confidence. Please let me know if you would be open to a conversation. Best regards, Julian Wright. I stared at the email for a long moment, thinking about the man who had fired me via midnight email, thinking about his attempt to erase my contributions, thinking about the manipulated metrics and shell companies and corporate theater that had corrupted everything I had built. Then I closed the laptop without responding. Some conversations weren't worth having. Some partnerships weren't worth considering. Some people would have to find their own way back to relevance without my help. I picked up my keys and walked out of the office, knowing that tomorrow there would be more partnership requests, more communities asking for authentic ESG investment, more opportunities to prove that sustainable finance could work when it was managed by people who actually cared about sustainability. The security guard nodded as I passed through the lobby. Have a good evening, Dr. Calderon, he said. You too, I replied, stepping out into the Manhattan night air, feeling something I hadn't experienced since that first day at Norwyn when I thought I was joining a company that shared my values. I was feeling like myself again, like someone who built systems that worked, like someone whose name couldn't be erased, like someone who proved that integrity wasn't just a nice idea. It was a requirement, and sometimes requirements needed to be enforced. The city lights reflected off the windows of corporate towers where executives were probably working late, scheming quarterly reports and stock presentations. But I wasn't looking up at those buildings anymore. I was looking ahead toward communities that would control their own development, toward farmers who would benefit from real investment, toward a world where ESG actually meant environmental social governance instead of executive shareholder greed. My phone buzzed one more time. A text from Sam in Chicago. Amina, he wrote. I saw the news about Gate 47. Mom and Dad would be proud. I smiled, typed back. They raised us to build something that matters, and kept walking through the city that had tried to break me but had instead taught me something more valuable than any corporate position. Sometimes, the best way to win isn't to destroy your enemies, sometimes it's to make them irrelevant. And as I walked home through the streets of Manhattan, I realized that was exactly what we had done. The funding agreement for Gate 47 sat on a wooden conference table that had seen better decades, its surface scarred by coffee rings and pen marks from countless meetings where people had argued about budgets and timelines and impact metrics, but never in a room that smelled like old books and strong coffee instead of the sanitized corporate air that circulated through Manhattan's glass towers. The only people present were Jonathan, Maria, James, Sarah, and me. No lawyers adjusting ties every 30 seconds. No media representatives checking phones for breaking news. No executives calculating how this would affect their stock options. Just 5 people who understood that $17.7 billion was meaningless unless it actually changed lives. The contract itself was different too. Written in language that prioritized clarity over legal complexity, structured to ensure accountability rather than protect corporate interests. Every clause designed to prevent the kind of manipulation that had turned my original ESG framework into Julian's marketing machine. The funding commitments were immutable. The impact verification protocols were transparent. The community oversight mechanism couldn't be overruled by board members more concerned with quarterly reports than quarterly outcomes. My name, Dr. Amina Calderon, appeared on the first page, not buried in footnotes, not hidden in technical specifications, not squeezed into margins like an afterthought, but right at the top under Chief Impact Officer in a font size that matched Jonathan's title as Executive Director, because this time the person who built the system would also control it. I picked up the pen, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. 6 months since that midnight termination email, 4 months since discovering the manipulated data, 3 months since Julian's failed presentation. 2 months since filing the whistleblower complaint, and 6 weeks since choosing to build something new instead of just tearing down something corrupt before signing. I thought about the path that had brought me here. The daughter of Panamanian immigrants who cleaned office buildings at night so their children could attend university during the day. The grad student who spent summers in rural Guatemala learning that environmental policy meant nothing without community input. The young professional who believed corporations could be partners in sustainable development instead of extractors disguised as partners. The sustainability expert who thought transparency and accountability could coexist with profit margins and stock performance. I thought about the farmers in Kenya who had trusted me with their transition from subsistence agriculture to sustainable farming practices, only to discover that Norwyn had used their success stories for marketing while defunding their actual projects. I thought about the communities in Peru who had welcomed our water conservation initiatives, then watched as their funding disappeared into shell companies with impressive names and empty bank accounts. I thought about the environmental scientists in Bangladesh who had spent months training local partners to monitor carbon reduction, only to see their data manipulated to support investment decisions that prioritized optics over outcomes. But mostly I thought about the moment when I realized that fighting Julian Wright wasn't enough, that exposing Norwyn's fraud wasn't sufficient, that proving my authorship of the ESG framework was meaningless, unless that framework actually served the people it was designed to protect. This is it. I said to the room, to myself, to the communities who would benefit from authentic ESG investment, to the future we're about to create with funding that couldn't be diverted, verification that couldn't be manipulated, and oversight that couldn't be eliminated by executives who saw social responsibility as a public relations opportunity. And I signed my full name, Dr. Amina Calderon, in handwriting that was clear, confident, unambiguous, the signature of someone who had learned that integrity wasn't just about personal ethics. It was about building systems that made corruption impossible. Then I added a line that wasn't in the original agreement: for those who build in silence, because this wasn't just about me, was about every person who had ever created something meaningful, only to watch it get hijacked by people who confused credit with contribution. Jonathan smiled, the kind of genuine expression that was impossible to fake after 30 years in finance. Maria nodded with the satisfaction of someone who understood that environmental science meant nothing without implementation. James leaned back in his chair like a man who had finally found an organization that matched his values, and Sarah took a photo with her phone, not for social media, not for press releases, but for the moment when we would need to remember why we started this. When the inevitable challenges and setbacks would make us question whether authentic ESG investing was possible in a world designed to reward performance over substance. My phone buzzed with a message from Clara, whose investigation had expanded from a single expo about Norwyn into a comprehensive series about corporate ESG fraud and the reformers working to fix it. Amina, she wrote, the Financial Times wants to run a profile on Gate 47's launch. Working title: The Woman Who Held the Line. Would you be interested in an interview? I typed back, yes, but only if we can do it at our Guatemala project site with the farmers who are actually benefiting from authentic ESG investment. Because the real story wasn't about corporate scandals and whistleblower complaints. The real story was about communities that controlled their own development, funding that served actual needs, and impact that could be measured by the people who experienced it within an hour of signing the agreement. My phone started buzzing with news alerts. Breakthrough ESG firm secures record funding, Gate 47, to manage 70 transparent impact investment. Former Norwyn architect launches revolutionary sustainability platform. ESG pioneer builds alternative to corporate greenwashing. But reading those headlines felt surreal, like watching someone else's life being summarized in bullet points and stock phrases. The notification that mattered most came from an encrypted messaging app. Malik writing from Kenya with a photo of solar panels being installed at a community center funded through our new verification system. the panels gleaming in afternoon sunlight while farmers gathered around, learning how the energy storage would power irrigation systems, grain processing equipment, evening literacy classes. "It works," he wrote, and I could hear the relief in his digital voice. The farmers control the funding, the community controls the oversight. The impact is real, measurable, immutable, exactly what we dreamed of building back when we thought Norwyn might actually sustainable development, instead of just talking about it. I stared at the photo, feeling something that might have been vindication or might have been hope. Farmers who understood exactly how their solar installation worked, how much energy it would generate, how many jobs it would create, and how their community would benefit, not because some corporate executive had calculated the public relations value, but because they had designed the project themselves with technical support that respected their expertise instead of replacing it. That evening, I walked through the empty gate whiteboards covered with project timelines, impact metrics, community partnership agreements. The infrastructure of something that couldn't be hijacked by executives who saw ESG as a marketing opportunity instead of a moral obligation. The space was smaller than Julian's personal office at Norwyn. It felt larger somehow, like a place where actual work got done, where decisions were made based on evidence, rather than quarterly projections, where success was measured by community outcomes, rather than stock performance. My laptop chimed with an email from an address I didn't recognize at first glance: Julian Wright, consulting@gmail.com, and I realized that Julian had left Norwyn too, probably not by choice given the SEC investigation and shareholder lawsuits, but the consulting email address suggested he was trying to reinvent himself as an independent advisor, acknowledge that his approach to ESG investing had been fundamentally flawed. Dr. Calderon, the message read. I wanted to reach out personally to congratulate you on Gate 47's success. It's clear that your vision for ESG verification was ahead of its time, and I'm glad to see it receiving the recognition it deserves. Your technical innovation, combined with your commitment to authentic impact measurement, represents the future of sustainable finance. Norwyn is implementing new ESG protocols based on lessons learned from recent challenges, and we would welcome the opportunity to discuss potential partnership with Gate 47. Your expertise would be invaluable as we work to rebuild investor confidence and restore our reputation in the sustainable finance community. I understand that our professional relationship ended under difficult circumstances, but I hope we can move forward with mutual respect and shared commitment to ESG excellence. The industry needs leaders like you, and I believe there are opportunities for collaboration that would benefit both our organizations. Please let me know if you would be open to a conversation about how we might work together to advance sustainable finance practices. Best regards, Julian Wright, Senior Partner, Wright, Sustainability Consulting. I read the email 3 times, feeling a mixture of disbelief, amusement, and something that might have been pity. Julian Wright, the man who had fired me via midnight email, who had stolen credit for my work, had manipulated impact data to serve corporate interests, who had built his reputation on lies, was now asking for my help to rebuild that reputation. The email was masterfully crafted, acknowledging my success without admitting his mistakes, praising my vision without accepting responsibility for corrupting it, suggesting collaboration without offering genuine partnership. Typical Julian Wright, smooth, professional, calculated, designed to achieve maximum benefit with minimum accountability. I closed the laptop without responding. Some conversations weren't worth having, some partnerships weren't worth considering, some people would have to find their own way back to relevance without my help. Julian had made his choices when he prioritized corporate theater over authentic impact, when he valued stock performance over community outcomes, when he decided that ESG investing was about marketing rather than measurement. The security guard nodded as I passed through the lobby, a middle-aged man named Carlos, whose night shift allowed him to attend community college during the day, pursuing a degree in environmental science, with dreams of working for organizations that actually cared about environmental protection. "Have a good evening, Dr. Calderon," he said. "You too, Carlos," I replied. "And how are your classes going?" "Really well," he said. "Excited, thanks for asking. I'm taking a course on sustainable development, and we're studying some of the work you did in Kenya before all this Norwyn stuff happened." I paused, feeling something warm and unexpected. "You're studying my work, not just yours," he said, "but yours is part of it. My professor says, you proved that ESG investing could work if it was done right, if communities controlled their own projects, if verification was transparent, if the people doing the work actually cared about the outcomes." "What's your professor's name?" "Dr. Martinez," he said. "She used to work for the World Bank, but she left because she said international development was being corrupted by organizations that cared more about publicity than progress." I made a mental note to reach out to Dr. Martinez to discuss potential partnerships between Gate 47 and universities, training the next generation of sustainability professionals. "Keep up the good work, Carlos," I said, "and let me know if you need any references for internships." Stepping out into the Manhattan night air, something I hadn't experienced since that first day at Norwyn, when I thought I was joining a company that shared my values, when I believed that corporate finance and community development could be partners instead of adversaries, when I trusted that people who talked about social responsibility actually meant what they said. I was feeling like myself again, like someone who built systems that worked, like someone whose name couldn't be erased, like someone who had proved that integrity wasn't just a nice idea, it was a requirement, and sometimes requirements needed to be enforced. Technical safeguards and legal protections, and the kind of moral courage that chose building over destroying the city lights reflected off the windows of corporate towers where executives were probably working late preparing quarterly reports, calculating stock projections, designing present that would make their companies look socially responsible without actually being socially responsible. But I wasn't looking up at those buildings anymore, wasn't thinking about the world I had left behind. I was looking ahead toward communities that would control their own development, toward farmers who would benefit from real investment, toward environmental projects that would be measured by their actual impact, toward a world where ESG actually meant environmental, social, and governance instead of executive shareholder greed. My phone buzzed one more time, a text from Sam, in Chicago. Amina wrote, "I saw the news about Gate 47, the funding announcement, the partnership agreements, the community oversight protocols. I also saw Julian's consulting website where he's calling himself a pioneer in authentic ESG investing. Apparently irony is dead, but more importantly I wanted to tell you that my dad would be proud, not just because you built something successful but because you built something that matters, because you proved that their immigrant daughter could change an entire industry, because you showed that integrity isn't just about personal values, it's about systemic change. You, and I'm proud of you." I stopped walking and typed back, "They raised us to build something that matters," and kept walking through the city that had tried to break me, but had instead taught me something more valuable than any corporate position, any stock options, any recognition from financial media. Sometimes the best way to win isn't to destroy your enemies, sometimes it's to make them irrelevant. And as I walked home, through the streets of Manhattan, thinking about farmers in Kenya and communities in Guatemala and environmental scientists in Bangladesh, who would now have funding that served their needs, instead of corporate marketing departments, I realized that was exactly what we had done. Gate 47 wasn't just an alternative to Norwyn's corrupted ESG framework, it was proof that sustainable finance could work when it was managed by people who actually understood sustainability, when it was controlled by communities who experienced its impact, when it was verified by systems that couldn't be manipulated by executives who confused performance with substance. The $17.7 billion that had been locked in my authentication system for 6 months would now flow projects designed by the communities they served, verified by transparent protocols, managed by people who measured success in jobs created, carbon, reduced water, conserved lives, improved rather than stock prices and quarterly reports. And somewhere in Manhattan, Julian Wright was probably revising his LinkedIn profile, trying to rebuild a reputation based on work he had stolen from someone else, trying to convince new clients that he understood authentic ESG investing, despite having spent years proving exactly the opposite. But that was his problem. Now his career to rebuild his reputation, restore his relevance to recover, and I had more important things to think about, like the solar installation in Kenya that would power irrigation systems for sustainable agriculture, like the water conservation project in Peru that would be managed by the communities it served, like the environment monitoring systems in Bangladesh that would provide real data for real decision-making. Walking through the city where this whole journey had started, where I had believed that corporate finance and community development could be partners, where I had learned that some partnerships were worth fighting for and others were worth abandoning, I felt something that might have been peace, or might have been satisfaction, or might have been the quiet confidence that comes from building something that can't be corrupted, because the real victory wasn't exposing Julian Wright's fraud or recovering my stolen work or proving that I had built the systems Norwyn claimed as their own. The real victory was creating something better, something that would outlast any individual scandal or corporate failure, something that proved sustainable finance could work when it was done by people who actually cared about sustainability. And as I reached my apartment building, I realized that sometimes the most important signature you ever make isn't the one that ends something, it's the one that begins everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from